Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. Today what we're going to work on is some methods to explore if you have a linoleum block and you want to do some relief printing from home, but you don't have access to a traditional setup for relief printing. So maybe you don't have a brayer, maybe you don't have ink or a space to roll out your ink. So we're going to explore some options using paints that you might have available to you at home, as well as some drawing materials. The first method that I'll be showing you is working with oil pastels. I'm also going to show you working with watercolor in order to achieve a repeatable print-like quality, as well as using oil paint. What we'll start off with when we get started is the oil pastels. I have two kinds of oil pastels here. These are the more traditional oil pastels. When I say traditional, I just mean these are the ones I see more commonly. They're a bit thicker, they're a bit of a harder oil pastel. So these are probably, if you have oil pastels at home, something like what you might have. These oil pastels are water soluble, and I don't see friends of mine and other artists use them quite as often, but they're a pastel that I came across a few years ago, and I really love them. Again, they're water soluble, which is nice for a lot of different reasons, but they're extremely soft and they work really nicely for this method. The whole idea of this video is that you can find ways to quote-unquote print at home with materials you might have. So I'm just showing you a couple options that you might explore in the way of oil pastels, or if you really like this method, some things you might look into in the future. But we've got our two types of oil pastels, the more traditional, harder pastel, and these very soft water-soluble pastels. And I'll talk more about the pros and cons of those once we get rolling. And again, we have oil paint, which you can use a brush to tap on and apply. And I also have some just basic sponges here. These are just cheap little cleaning sponges that I happen to have around the house so that I can tap that and have a smoother application of my oil paint when we go about that method. I also have watercolor right here, and for watercolor I have, as you might expect, some soft watercolor brushes. Those are really nice and absorbent for color, as you may know. And I also have a little atomizer with some water to wet down my paper for when we go about printing with the watercolor. So those are the drawing and painting materials that we're going to be using today. What you will also want to have is a couple blocks available to you. Obviously, you'll want to have your linoleum blocks carved out. In the effort of making something that we can do in almost any setting, we've just got some 8.5 by 11 computer paper that we're going to be using as our printing on. And I have some blue masking tape that we'll be using to tape down our print while we're setting up our registration. So with that said, we're going to get started. I'm going to set aside the paints for now, and we're going to start off with the oil pastel method. Oh. You'll also need something to use instead of a press for hand printing. So perhaps you have some Japanese barons or other types of barons. If you are a printmaker, you may have those things. If you're not someone who's done a lot of printmaking in the past, I'm gonna use today, this is just a little glass bowl. It has a nice, relatively smooth, flat surface, and it's a size that I can have a pretty nice pressure. I can apply a nice pressure onto. So that is something I'm gonna print with. And then I have this little leftover jar from some tea that I had a while back, and again, it just has a nice flat smooth surface, so I'm going to use this in lieu of a press for my hand printing. You could also use one of these tools, sometimes can be effective for hand printing as well. So again, just trying to show you a couple options, anything from things you can find in your kitchen all the way up to, you know, art supplies that you might have traditionally used for other methods. Okay, so we're gonna start off just applying color to our block. I want to start off with these water-soluble pastels that I discussed earlier. Just again, to talk about why these ones work pretty nice for this method. It's not to say you need this exact brand, anything like that, but I want to talk about the qualities of these pastels so that as you're thinking about supplies that you might have in your studio, what you might have that's similar. Whoops. All right, so again, when I'm talking about these, what I really love about them is they're very soft. As you can see, just touching them, I can get a lot of, I'm getting a lot of color on my hand. There's a lot of pigment coming off just by touching them. These are a fairly cheap oil pastel. They don't have the most rich, vibrant pigmentation, but the idea of this is some fun explorations from home that you can enjoy on a budget without, again, the more traditional printmaking setup. So these are really nice, and I'm going to go ahead and start applying them on the block so that you can get an idea of how to use this method. But again, they're a very soft, smooth pastel, and that's why they work so nice for this method. So all I'm doing is coloring on the surface that I want to print. I don't necessarily, I'm trying not to catch too much of my pastel on the edge because, of course, just like when we're printing in the traditional way, we don't want to over ink and end up with fuzzy edges. We don't want to end up scraping our drawing material against the edge and creating excess buildup of material that way. So when I'm close to my edges, I'm sort of going a little bit from the center away toward the edge rather than starting at the edge and working toward the center. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, just covering my whole surface as thoroughly as I can, trying to be mindful of my edges to keep things nice and clean as possible. Okay, so I've got this well covered, and you might think, all right, we're ready to print. Not quite, because we're hand printing and because we are using oil pastels instead of traditional ink, which would be a much wetter material. I want to go over this again and really build up that material as much as possible. So even though I have color over my entire work surface, I want to just go over it a little bit more and really build up the color. So what I'm doing is I'm just swirling my pastel into this a bit more just to see that I've kind of got enough material built up that it's to a point where it's almost moving itself around. So normally we talk about, well, we don't want to over ink. In this case, that's still true, but you're really going to want to build that material up. Okay, so we have our well applied block with the oil pastel on there. So the other thing that we have available to us here, as you might have expected, we've got our registration all set up. I have a bit of tape here so that I can tape down my paper when I'm ready to print. And I have got some little cardboard, chipboard, taped where I'm going to be placing the block so that it doesn't move around while I'm trying to print. Now, when we print on presses, you may or may not go this route with the chipboard. You might just be using tape to kind of hold your block into place. But because we're hand printing and we might be having to go over our print a couple of times, maybe even lifting the paper to give it a little peek before we move on, it's a really good idea to have that little extra insurance by putting some of that chipboard down. So we have our block nice and safe where it is, and then of course the blue line is showing us where our paper is going to fall, and again the tape is where I'm going to tape my paper down. When you go to print, you may or may not need something to help things to glide more smoothly while you're rubbing your paper on top of your print. So what I have here is just some baking parchment paper. If you have wax paper, that might work as well. Depending on the smoothness of the object you find to do your rubbing with, you might not need anything at all. Just having an extra sheet of computer paper on top in order to protect your print may well be enough. So those are just a few things that you'll want to check out as you're practicing. So again, I just have this little glass bowl that I found in my kitchen, and I'm gonna start trying to print off my pastel. If you've hand printed before, you might know that you want to apply a pretty heavy amount of pressure. You know, you're going to feel this in your arm. You're going to work your muscles a little bit doing this method. That's not to say it should be painstaking or anything like that, but it does take some elbow grease, as it were. So I'm just rubbing this in some circles. I'm making sure that I go over every surface that I colored on very thoroughly. So working in circular motions from one side, slowly over to the other side, working my way up my spaceman, and back down again. To give myself a little extra insurance before I peek at my print, I'm just going to take the edge of this bowl and give it a little more zhuzh throughout the image area. What's happening, which is really nice, I don't know if it's picking up on camera, I'm sort of able to see my image a little bit through that paper that I'm printing on. So that's a really nice thing for me to see and be aware of, because it's just reminding me where I want to make sure to apply the most pressure. So let's see how he's doing and whether or not we want to move on. So yeah, you can't see that through the camera, but I can definitely see to some extent a little bit of an embossment from where I rubbed, but I can certainly see the pigment kind of coming through, which is a really good sign. And that's not bad. So we're gonna go ahead and run with that. That's a pretty good application of material. A couple things I notice is, you know, I've got a little extra buildup of material in a couple places. So if I wanted to, I could maybe smooth that back out, but you know, this isn't going to be necessarily the same. This isn't going to be the same as printing with a brayer on a press. So we've got a couple little imperfections there that we might be able to smooth out, but you know, there again, as we continue on with the printing process and adding our other layers, those might not be such an issue anyway. But yeah, we got pretty good results from that. So I'm really satisfied with how that worked out. What I'm going to show next is using the other type of oil pastel with this method. So I'm going to set this aside and we'll check those out. So here we've got the more, you know, I say more traditional oil pastel. They're a little bit stiffer, a little bit harder. You know, I guess now that I'm rubbing them, they are pretty soft. I mean, they're not so strikingly different than those water-soluble ones, but you might see when I'm applying to the block, there's a little bit of a difference in their moisture level and therefore the smoothness when you're starting to put it on the block. So we'll be checking that out. With these ones. So here I've got my one of my background blocks, so we'll use that for the other type of oil pastel. We did blue. We'll give him a green background, I guess. Not that that matters, but yeah, he's in a toxic world. Okay, so once again, adding this to the block. Now, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but again, this pastel has a slightly different texture to it, and I don't know if you can tell or not on camera, but it's not building up quite as fast as the other one. It's not rolling quite as smooth as the other one. It's gonna work. It's just something that when you're thinking about the materials that you're going to use for this, you're gonna want to think about how they fare in things like their moisture and their smoothness and how well they blend out from one another. Right now I'm just trying to get the paper off of my oil pastel because it's a little easier to work with if I can hold it flat. So, getting back to it. So once again, I have this pretty well coated, but I'm just going over it once more to really build that pastel pigment on top of itself. And the difference in feeling that I'm experiencing as I'm doing this, when I first started off with my pastel, I almost could feel like a little bit of a resistance coming from the pastel against the block. Now things are moving a lot more smooth and fluidly, so that's sort of the feeling that you want to look for to give yourself an idea on whether or not your pastel is building up the way you want it to. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple things before I print this one. Again, the difference of the pastel, that got a little bit flaky in spots, so I'm just going to kind of take those pieces that chunked up, rub them in a little bit, giving it a little bit of a smoothing out, especially in any of these areas where, let me see if I can get it on camera. You can't quite tell, but what I'm seeing is in here there's sort of a space where the oil pastel is really thick, and you can see that it's sort of chunky, but then in the vicinity next to it, it's a little bit thinner. So I'm just gonna see if I can smooth out those imperfections, create as smooth a surface as I can. Another thing that happened here, because of the difference in the texture of our oil pastel, we do have a little bit more of a messy situation around the insides of our block where we don't want to see that green color coming through. So what I'm doing is just taking my nail and trying to clean up those areas where the pastel is muddying my edges, so to speak, or runs the risk of muddying my edges. This is especially happening where I've got these little tiny details. So I'm just doing it with my nails. If you might want to grab a Q-tip, or a toothpick would also be a good solution to tidying up those edges. One of the nice things about the oil pastels is they are non-toxic. So, you know, you see me getting these things on my fingers, under my nails. That's not going to hurt me, which is another nice thing about this method. It's very clean. It's very non-toxic. One of the things I love about the oil pastels, it's also pretty minimal on the cleanup side of things and pretty cost effective. The first oil pastels I showed you, they're like $10 for a pack of 24. So 24 colors for $10 gives you a nice variety. I haven't checked these out recently. This is pastels I've had hanging around for a while, but you can get a lot of colors in a pack, and that can give you some nice variety and nice bang for your buck compared to maybe what you'd be able to achieve with a set of paints. It of course depends on the quality of your paints, but if you're using like a really low quality watercolor set, it may not have the pigmentation you need for this process. So the oil pastels, a little more value for your dollar, I think, but it comes down to personal preference. Once again, getting back to what I'm actually trying to show you here is I'm just kind of blending with my finger to smooth out my background, and I also did a little cleaning up with my fingernail. You could use a toothpick or a Q-tip around those edges so that I don't have quite as much fuzziness. So I'm checking out those thin spots. I'm going to hit it again with my oil pastel. Again, you know, thinking about the difference in the type of product you're using. I talked about these being a little bit drier, a little bit stiffer of a material. You see I'm working into this plate a little bit more before I dive into my printing, whereas the other one, I was able to build that color up pretty quickly. So just something to know as you're troubleshooting, a couple things to look for, thinking about how your materials are functioning for you. So we're going to go ahead and give this a shot. So I'm going to bring my registration back. I have my paper nice and taped down so I can have registration work out nicely. I'm going to pop in block number 2. Cover it up with my wax paper, and we're going to see how this works out. All right, let's see how that went. Not bad. All right, so there's 2 different oil pastel possibilities for you. 2 different, slightly different types of oil pastel, and you can see the difference in how they worked, and hopefully I talked through some of the pros and cons of, not necessarily pros and cons, but hopefully I talked through a little bit of a troubleshooting as far as the different material that you might be working with. So here we've got, again, that more crumbly, drier oil pastel versus the soft water-soluble oil pastel. So you can kind of see what's going on there. And that's oil pastels. That's printing with oil pastels. What we're going to move into next is watercolor. All right, actually, before we move on from oil pastels, let's talk about how we can clean these blocks. Much like what you might use in the printmaking studio, depending on where you're practicing printmaking. We have some vegetable oil in the printmaking studio where I'm an instructor, we use food grade mineral oil, pretty much the same thing. So we're just going to use that to get this oil pastel off of our blocks. If you want to go about degreasing, you can use a little bit of vinegar to wipe them down and soak up some of that oil. In my case, I'm just going to thoroughly dry these. I'm not too worried about degreasing them right now. All right, so again, one of the things I really like about the possibility of using these oil pastels is it's pretty easy to clean up. You know, you can see this is a little table I have in my kitchen. Any of these marks that I got on the table are going to be really easy to remove. I didn't make a mess of anything. They come in a little box, so they're really easy to put away and take care of, and I don't have to worry about cleaning brayers or cleaning up glass palettes or anything along those lines. You know, because depending on the home studio that you have, if you even have a home studio, you may not want to get into all of that. Or you might not be able to, depending on where your situation is. But you can still print make even if you don't have a studio. And that's really the important thing that I want to stress is, as artists, it's not about where we're making our work. It's about getting creative and finding ways to make the things that we're passionate about making, regardless of how nice our studio setup is. So hopefully this will inspire some of you to explore and not feel intimidated about diving in and doing some things like printmaking, which seem like you would need a fancy studio for, but you really don't. You know, sometimes we start practicing things like that, and you know, at the end of the day, it can almost hold us back from being an artist because we get so caught up in feeling like we need all these great facilities that we then feel like we can't be artists in our own spaces. So hopefully this is an example of that. And that hopefully will also conclude my speeches for the day. Not a guarantee, but I am gonna go ahead and call myself out right now. You might want to put your vegetable oil, if this is coming out of your kitchen cupboard, into a smaller container so that you're not putting your paper towel that you're wiping up art materials with on the mouth of your oil container. So keep that in mind. Okay, so this one cleaned up really nicely. There's a little bit of color still on the back. I might get that off camera. This one could still use a little work. Again, really helpful if you have a Q-tip or a toothpick. I'll just grab a toothpick to show you. If you have a plate with a lot of details in it, you can kind of clean it up. And this might even be while you're printing. You know, you might, before you go in to print, take a Q-tip, or I mean this toothpick, something like that, and clean up your edges if they need it. So I don't know if you can see or not. There's just a little bit of oil pastel in this detail here. So I'm just trying to tidy that up so that it's not blocking me, or so that it's not filling up on my print with the next method that we're going to talk about. And I'll just go ahead and talk about degreasing. Even though I said I was going to skip it, I'm actually not going to skip it because I need to use these blocks for something else in a couple minutes here. So for degreasing, I just have a cotton ball that I put some white vinegar on. And I'm just going over that again to pick up that oil, pick up any remaining color that might be stuck on my block. The oil, as you may know, acts to loosen up the oil pastel or the ink. And then the vinegar is a nice final cleaning step. So that's what we're doing here. Working into that background that I said was still a little bit stained from the color. And getting this nice and clean so that we can watercolor on it. Another nice option, if you happen to have it in your home, is sort of wet wipes or baby wipes. Those can be very useful in cleaning up blocks as well, because they're a little bit more durable than most paper towels. Not so much the cleaning product that's on them, but just that durability of those is really helpful. Okay, so that block is nice and clean and ready to go. Again, all we used was some basic vegetable oil on a paper towel to loosen up the oil and wipe it away. And then we did a final step with a cotton ball, or you could have used a paper towel saturated with white vinegar to help pull away the excess oil and excess color that might have been left behind.